To understand the sheer magnitude of what occurred in the spring of 1944, one must first understand the silence of the Naga Hills. This is a silence that is not empty, but heavy. It is a silence composed of thick, tangled jungle, of steep ravines that drop away into nothingness, and of a humidity that clings to a man's skin like a second shirt. Before the artillery shells shattered the trees and before the smell of cordite overpowered the scent of damp earth and pine, this remote corner of northeast India, bordering Burma, was a place of quiet endurance. It is here, in the ridges surrounding the small administrative station of Kohima, that the fate of the British Empire in Asia would hang by the thinnest of threads. Let us transport ourselves back to that time. The world is consumed by the Second World War. While eyes are turned toward the beaches of Normandy and the naval battles of the Pacific, a massive, desperate gamble is being played out in these misty hills. This is the story of the Battle of Kohima, often called the Stalingrad of the East, though few in the West speak of it today. It is a story not just of strategy, but of isolation, thirst, and the raw, intimate brutality of close-quarters combat in a place where the jungle itself was an enemy. To the west lies India, the jewel in the British crown, and its railway lines that feed the war effort. To the east lies Burma, occupied by the Imperial Japanese Army. Separating them are the razor-backed ridges of the Arakan and the Naga Hills, terrain so inhospitable that most military planners believed no large army could move through it with speed or heavy equipment. But in early 1944, Lieutenant General Renyam Mutaguchi, commander of the Japanese 15th Army, decides to prove them wrong. His plan, known as Operation Yugo, is audacious. He intends to hurl his divisions across the Chindwin River through the impossible jungle tracks, to seize the supply bases at Imphal and Kohima. If he succeeds, the road to India lies open. If he succeeds, the British 14th Army will be cut off and destroyed. Imagine the movement of the Japanese 31st Division as they begin their march in March of 1944. It is a feat of logistics and endurance that borders on the miraculous. Thousands of soldiers, leading oxen and mules, carrying heavy mortar plates and machine guns on their backs, navigate trails meant only for goats. They move beneath the canopy, invisible to aerial reconnaissance, a silent tide sweeping westward. They are counting on speed. They are counting on capturing British supplies because they have brought only enough rice for a few weeks. They are marching on the edge of starvation before the first shot is even fired. In Kohima, life proceeds with a deceptive calm. Kohima is not a fortress. It is a hill station, a stopover on the vital road that winds from the railhead at Dimapur up to the depots at Imphal. The geography here is critical to visualize. The road snakes through the mountains, and at Kohima, it passes over a saddle, a ridge that dominates the surrounding valleys. Whoever holds Kohima holds the road. Whoever holds the road controls the flow of food, fuel, and ammunition to the main British forces fighting further south in Imphal. The garrison at Kohima is small. It is a patchwork force. There are men from the Assam Regiment, local Naga soldiers who know the terrain better than anyone. There are administrative clerks, mechanics, and convalescents recovering from malaria. It is not a force designed to stop a division of 15,000 battle-hardened Japanese infantry. But as intelligence reports begin to trickle in during late March, reports of Japanese patrols appearing where they shouldn't be, a frantic effort is made to reinforce the station. Enter the 4th Battalion of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment. These men, fresh from the Arakan front, are weary but disciplined. They arrive in Kohima just as the jaws of the trap are beginning to close. They rumble up the dusty road in their trucks, looking out at the steep slopes covered in pine and oak, unaware that they are entering a box from which there will be no retreat. By the 4th of April, the Japanese 31st Division under Lieutenant General Sato has achieved the impossible. They have crossed the jungle ranges and are descending upon Kohima. The speed of their advance catches the British command off guard. The perimeter at Kohima is hurriedly established. It is roughly a mile long, shaped like a lopsided triangle straddling the ridge. It encompasses the district commissioner's bungalow, the tennis court, the jail hill, and the supply depots. The first sign of the coming storm is not a grand barrage, but the crack of rifles in the outer perimeter. The Japanese probe the defenses, testing for weaknesses. The men of the Assam Regiment fight a delaying action on the outlying ridge of Kharasam, holding back waves of attackers to buy time for the West Kents to dig in. The digging is difficult. The ground is hard, filled with roots and shale. Men dig slit trenches, piling the earth high, reinforcing their positions with logs and sandbags. They check their Lee-Enfield rifles, lay out their grenades, and wait. The nights in the Naga Hills are cold, and a heavy mist often settles in the valleys, muffling sound and reducing visibility to a few yards. On the 5th of April, the road back to Dimapur is cut. The Japanese have encircled the garrison. The siege of Kohima has begun. Inside the perimeter, there are roughly 2,500 men. Outside, surrounding them on the higher ground, are 15,000 Japanese soldiers with artillery support. The mathematics of the battle are grim. The geography of the British position becomes a series of islands in a sea of fire. There is Garrison Hill, the highest point within the perimeter. There is Kuki Pike. There is the Detail Issue Hill. And there is the district commissioner's bungalow, situated on a terrace cut into the hillside. Next to the bungalow sits a tennis court, a flat rectangular space that will soon become one of the most infamous battlegrounds in military history. But for now, it is just an asphalt court, surrounded by wire netting, sitting quietly in the mountain air. As the Japanese close the ring, they bring up their infantry guns. These are small, portable artillery pieces that can be manhandled up steep slopes. They position them on the ridges overlooking the British positions. The bombardment begins. It is methodical and relentless. The defenders crouch in their trenches as the earth shakes. Shrapnel tears through the trees, stripping the leaves and turning the pine forest into a collection of splintered stumps. The noise is deafening, a constant, rolling thunder that echoes off the valley walls, making it impossible to tell where one explosion ends and the next begins. But the shelling is only the prelude. The Japanese infantry tactics rely on the charge. They wait for nightfall. The British and Indian soldiers, straining their eyes into the darkness, listen for the snap of a twig or the rustle of dry leaves. The attacks come in waves. The Japanese soldiers, screaming their war cries, surge up the slopes, hurling grenades. The darkness erupts with the flash of Bren guns and the staccato rattle of Japanese Type 92 heavy machine guns. The fighting is confused and desperate. In the darkness, the front line is fluid. A trench held by the British at dusk might be overrun by midnight and retaken by dawn. The distance between the combatants shrinks. It is no longer a battle of maneuver. It is a battle of grenades thrown at ranges of 10 or 20 yards. It is a battle of bayonets and kukris. The men of the Royal West Kents and the Assam Regiment fight with a stubbornness that surprises the attackers. They do not break. They simply contract, pulling back from the outer perimeters as the pressure becomes unbearable, tightening their circle around Garrison Hill. One of the most critical shortages affecting the defenders is not ammunition, but water. The main water supply, a spring located outside the perimeter, is captured by the Japanese early in the siege. The garrison is left with only a few water tanks and what little can be scavenged. Water rationing is immediately imposed, half a mug a day per man. In the heat of the day, with the dust of explosions filling the air and the physical exertion of combat, the thirst becomes a torment. Men's tongues swell in their mouths, lips crack and bleed, yet the discipline holds. No one touches the reserve water without orders. The medical situation deteriorates rapidly. The shallow trenches dug for the wounded, the regimental aid post, are overflowing. There is no way to evacuate the casualties. They lie in the open trenches, protected only by sandbags, subjected to the same mortar fire as the fighting men. The doctors and orderlies work under impossible conditions, performing surgeries by the light of hurricane lamps, with dwindling supplies of morphine and bandages. The smell of the battlefield changes. It becomes a mixture of unburied bodies, open wounds, cordite, and raw sewage, for there is nowhere to dispose of waste in the shrinking perimeter. By the 7th and 8th of April, the Japanese attacks intensify. They focus their efforts on the Jail Hill and the Detail Issue Hill. The fighting here is savage. The Japanese infantry, displaying a disregard for their own lives that terrifies and awes the defenders, climb over the bodies of their fallen comrades to reach the British parapets. The British defensive fire is disciplined. The Bren gunners fire in short, controlled bursts, conserving their barrels and their ammunition. The riflemen pick their targets. Communication with the outside world is maintained by radio. The garrison commander, Colonel Richards, speaks calmly to the 33rd Corps back in Dimapur. He outlines the situation. He asks for air support. He asks for ammo drops. He does not ask for evacuation, for he knows it is impossible. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces begin their supply runs. Flying C-47 Dakotas and Hurricanes, the pilots brave the Japanese anti-aircraft fire and the treacherous mountain currents to drop crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and water. However, the perimeter is so small that many of the drops fall into Japanese hands. The defenders watch in frustration as parachutes carrying vital mortar shells drift over the wire and land in the enemy lines. It is a cruel irony. The Japanese, starving and low on supplies themselves, are being resupplied by the very Air Force trying to destroy them. But enough gets through. Without these airdrops, the garrison would have collapsed within days. As the second week of April approaches, the focus of the battle shifts to the district commissioner's bungalow. This sector is held by a company of the Royal West Kents. The bungalow itself is a wooden structure with a tin roof, raised on stilts. It sits on a terrace, and directly below it is the tennis court. The Japanese occupy the area above the bungalow, and they begin to dig in on the other side of the tennis court. The distance between the adversaries is the length of a tennis court, roughly 24 yards. This specific location becomes the crucible of the battle. The Japanese dig foxholes on one side of the court, the British dig in on the other. They shout insults at each other across the net. They throw grenades like cricket balls. A soldier raises his head to fire and instantly draws fire from a dozen rifles. The bungalow itself is slowly blasted apart. First the roof goes, shredded by mortar fire. Then the walls are blown out, leaving only the skeletal timber frame and the brick chimney standing amidst the debris. The nights at the tennis court are surreal. The Japanese creep forward in the darkness, trying to crawl under the wire. The British roll grenades down the slope. The explosions light up the faces of men locked in a death grip. It is intimate, horrific warfare. There is no room for strategy here. It is simply a test of will. Who can endure the terror longer? Who can stay awake when the body screams for sleep? The soldiers on both sides are filthy, bearded, their uniforms torn and stained. They live in holes in the ground, surrounded by the dead they cannot bury. Meanwhile, a few miles to the north at Dimapur, the British relief force is gathering. The 2nd Division, a mighty formation, is preparing to smash its way up the road to relieve Kohima. They have tanks, Grant and Lee tanks, massive steel beasts that look out of place in these jungle hills. But the road is blocked. The Japanese have established strong roadblocks at Zubza, miles before Kohima. The relief force must fight its way up, mile by bloody mile, clearing every ridge, every bunker. The garrison at Kohima can hear the distant rumble of the 2nd Division's artillery. It is the sound of hope, but it feels agonizingly far away. Inside the perimeter, the situation is becoming critical. The Japanese capture the Detail Issue Hill. This forces the defenders back even further, compressing them onto Garrison Hill. The crowding is dangerous. A single mortar shell landing in a trench now causes multiple casualties. The air is thick with flies. The bluebottles swarm over the dead and the living alike, adding a layer of psychological torment to the physical suffering. General Sato, the Japanese commander, is also facing a crisis, though the British do not know it yet. His troops are starving. The supply lines he was promised have not materialized. His men are eating grass, lizards, and the small amount of rice they carried with them. They are fighting with a desperation born of hunger. Sato knows he must take Kohima quickly, or his army will perish. He throws everything he has at the shrinking British perimeter. On the night of the 13th of April, the shelling reaches a crescendo. The Japanese launch a massive assault on the FSD, the field supply depot. The fighting is hand-to-hand. Men use shovels and pickaxes when their ammunition runs dry. The perimeter shrinks again. The British are now holding an area barely 400 yards by 500 yards. They are clinging to the summit of Garrison Hill like castaways on a shrinking island. The wounded at the aid post are now in the direct line of fire. There is no safe place left. The doctors continue to work, their aprons stiff with blood, ignoring the bullets whizzing overhead. The padre moves among the men, offering prayers and comfort. He buries the dead in shallow graves when he can, but often the bodies must simply be piled up to form protective parapets. It is a grim necessity. The dead protect the living. By the 15th of April, the garrison is at its breaking point. The men have been fighting for 10 days without rest. They are dazed from the concussion of explosions. They are dehydrated. Their eyes are hollow, staring out from faces masked in dust and grime. They are running low on grenades. The Japanese are so close that the British can hear them talking, can hear the clink of their equipment. The Japanese shout in English, "Give up, Johnny." It's over, the British reply with bursts of Bren gun fire. But just as the end seems inevitable, the sound of the relief column grows louder. The British 2nd Division has broken through the roadblocks at Zubza. Their tanks are grinding their way up the tortuous road. On the 18th of April, the leading elements of the relief force, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Berkshire Regiment, link up with the defenders. The scene is one of overwhelming emotion. The fresh troops, clean and well-fed, look with shock at the scarecrows who come out of the trenches to meet them. The men of the Royal West Kents who have held the line against impossible odds are finally relieved. They stumble down the road, some weeping, some too numb to feel anything. They are marched out, leaving the battlefield to the fresh troops. However, the Battle of Kohima is not over. The siege is broken, but the Japanese are not defeated. They still hold the commanding heights around the town. They still hold the bungalow and the tennis court. They still hold the Naga village that overlooks the road. The relief of the garrison marks only the end of the first phase. Now begins the second phase, the counteroffensive. The slow, grinding task of pushing the Japanese off the ridges they have captured. The arrival of the 2nd Division changes the nature of the battle. It introduces heavy armor. The British tanks, initially thought useless in such steep terrain, proved to be decisive. The engineers perform miracles, cutting tracks into the hillsides, winching tanks up slopes that seem vertical. The tanks can bring their 75mm guns to bear on the Japanese bunkers at point-blank range. But before we discuss the counterattack, we must pause to consider the environment in late April. The weather begins to turn. The pre-monsoon rains arrive. The dust of the battlefield turns into mud. Thick, glutinous mud that sucks the boots off soldiers' feet. The trenches fill with water. The hillsides become slippery slides. The misery of the soldiers deepens. Living in wet clothes, sleeping in mud, with trench foot and dysentery becoming rampant. The jungle, which had been stripped bare by the shelling, begins to rot. The smell of the battlefield, already terrible, becomes unbearable in the heat and the damp. The focus of the battle returns to the tennis court. The Japanese still hold the high ground above it. The British 2nd Division, specifically the Dorsets and the Camerons, are tasked with clearing this sector. The Japanese have turned the area under the bungalow into a honeycomb of bunkers. They have dug deep into the earth, creating interconnected fighting positions reinforced with logs. Artillery fire bounces off these bunkers. Aerial bombardment disturbs the earth, but leaves the defenders inside alive. The only way to clear them is to go in. Infantrymen have to crawl forward under covering fire and push pole charges, explosives on the end of long bamboo poles, into the firing slits of the bunkers. It is suicide work. A man has to expose himself to machine gun fire to get close enough. If he succeeds, there is a dull thud, and the bunker is silenced. If he fails, he lies where he falls, adding to the detritus of the tennis court. The battle for the tennis court becomes a war of attrition within a war of attrition. A tank is winched up the hill. It sits on the road, firing directly into the Japanese positions on the other side of the court. The range is less than 30 yards. The tank commander describes seeing the Japanese soldiers through his periscope, seeing the muzzle flashes of their rifles. He fires high-explosive shells into the earth banks, blasting away the cover, exposing the enemy. Simultaneously, the battle rages for the Naga village. This village sits on a high ridge to the north. It is a maze of traditional Naga houses, built of wood and thatch, sitting on stone platforms. The Japanese have fortified every house. The British troops have to clear the village house by house. The fighting is confused. A soldier kicks open a door, throws a grenade, and bursts in with a bayonet. The combat is primal. It is important to understand the Japanese soldier of 1944. He is indoctrinated with the code of Bushido. Surrender is not an option. It is the ultimate shame. He is expected to fight until death. Even when wounded, even when starving, the Japanese soldier continues to fire his weapon. This makes clearing the ridges incredibly costly. There are no easy victories. Every yard of ground has to be paid for in blood. As May begins, the monsoon breaks in earnest. The rain comes down in sheets. The visibility drops to zero. The battlefield becomes a quagmire. Supply trucks slide off the roads and tumble into the ravines. Mules, the most reliable form of transport, lose their footing and break their legs. The soldiers are perpetually wet. Their skin goes white and wrinkled. Leeches drop from the trees, fastening themselves to necks and ankles. The war becomes a struggle against the elements as much as against the enemy. General Slim, the commander of the 14th Army, is watching the situation closely. He knows that he must crush the Japanese 15th Army here at Kohima, and Imphal before the monsoon makes movement completely impossible. He is funneling more troops into the area. The 7th Indian Infantry Division is moving up. The British 33rd Corps is exerting massive pressure. But General Sato, the Japanese commander, is in a hopeless position. His men have not eaten a proper meal in weeks. They are riddled with malaria and dysentery. They have no ammunition left for their artillery. They are fighting with rifles and bayonets against tanks and massive artillery barrages. Sato radios his superiors, demanding supplies. He is told to eat leaves. He is told to capture Churchill's supplies. The bitterness between Sato and the army command grows. He realizes his division is being sacrificed. Yet on the ground, the Japanese soldier fights on. The defense of the GPT Ridge, the General Purpose Transport Ridge, is fanatical. The British attack it repeatedly. They use artillery to smash the bunkers. They use flamethrowers to burn out the defenders. The flamethrower is a terrifying weapon. A jet of liquid fire shoots into the bunker, consuming the oxygen and burning everything inside. It is a horrific way to die, and a horrific weapon to use. The soldiers who operate them are often targeted specifically by enemy snipers. In the midst of this carnage, there are moments of strange humanity. A ceasefire is arranged to collect the wounded. For a few hours, the guns fall silent. Japanese and British stretcher-bearers work in the same narrow strip of no man's land. They exchange cigarettes. They look at each other, men from the shires of England and men from the rice fields of Japan. And for a moment, they are just men, united by the shared misery of the war. Then the whistle blows, they return to their lines, and the killing resumes. By mid-May, the British have slowly, agonizingly, begun to pry the Japanese fingers off the ridges. The tennis court is finally cleared. The scene is apocalyptic. The ground is churned up so thoroughly that it looks like a plowed field. The trees are gone, replaced by shattered stumps. The bungalow is nothing but a pile of rubble. The bodies of hundreds of men lie intermingled with the mud. But the Japanese still hold the Arajura Spur, a formidable ridge south of Kohima. This is the lock that must be broken to fully open the road to Imphal. The attacks on Arajura are some of the costliest of the campaign. The slopes are steep, covered in thick jungle that has grown back with the rains. The Japanese have had weeks to prepare. They have sighted their machine guns along the tracks. As the British infantry advance up the Arajura Spur, they are met with a wall of fire. The rain makes the footing treacherous. Men slip and fall as they try to charge. The attack stalls. It is a low point for the British. The commanders realize that a frontal assault is futile. They must find another way. They must outflank the position. This leads to a wide hooking maneuver. A brigade is sent on a long, arduous march through the deep jungle to come in behind the Japanese positions. It is a nightmare march. The soldiers have to hack their way through bamboo thickets. They have to climb cliffs using ropes. They are carrying all their equipment on their backs. If a man is injured, he has to be carried. There is no evacuation. While this flanking maneuver is underway, the pressure on the Japanese main line is maintained. The artillery never stops. The 25-pounder guns are firing around the clock. The gun crews are exhausted, their ears ringing, their bodies aching from lifting the heavy shells. The empty shell casings pile up in great brass mounds. The psychological toll on the Japanese is immense. They are being pounded day and night. They are starving. Their comrades are dying of disease all around them. General Sato finally makes a fateful decision. Without orders from his superiors, he decides to withdraw. He realizes that to stay is to commit mass suicide. He orders his division to retreat. This is the turning point. Late in May, the Japanese begin to pull back from Kohima. They leave behind their heavy equipment. They leave behind their unburied dead. They begin the long, sorrowful march back towards the Chindwin River. They are a broken army. They are moving skeletons, stumbling through the mud, harassed by British aircraft and pursued by the vengeance of the 14th Army. The silence begins to return to the Naga Hills. But it is a different silence now. It is the silence of a graveyard. The Battle of Kohima effectively ends in June, as the road to Imphal is finally cleared and the convoy trucks begin to roll through, linking up with the besieged forces in the south. As the guns around Kohima slowly fell silent in early June 1944, a different kind of horror began to unfold in the deep valleys and jungle tracks leading east toward the Chindwin River. The retreat of the Japanese 31st Division was not a structured military withdrawal. It was a slow, agonizing disintegration of a fighting force. General Sato had made the decision to pull back to save what was left of his men, but for thousands of them, the order came too late. They had entered India as proud warriors of the emperor, believing they were invincible. They were leaving as hollowed-out shells of men, defeated not just by British steel but by the microscopic enemies of the jungle, malaria, dysentery, and cholera. The path of their retreat became known to the British soldiers who followed them as the Path of Bones. It is difficult to describe the scene without recoiling, but to understand the totality of this campaign, one must visualize it. The monsoon rains were now falling incessantly, turning the jungle floor into a slurry of mud and rotting vegetation. Through this gray, weeping landscape, the Japanese survivors stumbled. They had no food. The supply lines had completely collapsed. Men were reduced to eating bamboo shoots, jungle grass, and in the most desperate cases, the flesh of their pack animals or even their fallen comrades. The British 2nd Division and the 7th Indian Division did not simply watch them go. They pursued, but the pursuit was hampered by the same mud that trapped the Japanese. Tanks bogged down, their tracks spinning helplessly in the deep clay. Trucks slid off the precipitous roads, tumbling hundreds of feet into the ravines below. It became an infantryman's war again, a slow, slogging march through a green hell. The pursuing troops would find the Japanese rearguards waiting for them, small groups of starving men left behind in foxholes with a few rounds of ammunition, ordered to fight to the death to buy time for the main body to escape. These were skeletal figures, often too weak to stand, yet they would fire their rifles with the last ounces of their strength until they were overrun. While the pursuit into the jungle continued, the primary strategic objective shifted to the road. The Imphal Road. For months, the garrison at Imphal, 60 miles to the south, had been cut off, supplied only by air. The siege of Kohima was over, but the siege of Imphal was still in effect. The road had to be opened. The lifeline had to be reconnected. The task fell to the 2nd Division, driving south from Kohima, and the 5th Indian Division, fighting its way north from Imphal. Between them lay 60 miles of winding mountain road, held by determined pockets of Japanese resistance, and blocked by massive landslides triggered by the monsoon rains. The Royal Engineers, the sappers, became as important as the infantry. They worked in the pouring rain, often under sniper fire, using bulldozers and explosives to clear the debris that blocked the tarmac. The advance was a slow, grinding affair. Every bend in the road, every culvert, every ridge overlooking the asphalt was a potential ambush site. The British tanks, the Lees and Grants, would inch forward, their commanders buttoned up inside the humid, reeking steel hulls, scanning the tree line for the flash of an anti-tank gun. The infantry walked alongside the tanks, using the armor as cover, spraying the jungle with Bren gun fire at the slightest suspicion of movement. On the 22nd of June, 1944, a moment occurred that would be etched into the history of the Burma Campaign. It happened at mile 109, near a small village called Tufima. The leading tanks of the British 2nd Division, pushing south from Kohima, spotted movement ahead. Through the mist and the rain, they saw shapes that looked like tanks. But they were not Japanese. They were the Grants of the 7th Light Cavalry, the vanguard of the 5th Indian Division pushing north from Imphal. The link-up was historic. Soldiers from both armies, men who had been fighting in isolation for months, ran toward each other. They ignored the rain. They ignored the mud. They shook hands, they embraced, they shared cigarettes. It was a meeting of survivors. The siege of Imphal was technically broken. The road was open, but it was a fragile opening. The Japanese were still in the hills on either side of the road, and convoys would have to run a gauntlet of fire for weeks to come. Yet the psychological impact of this moment was profound. For the first time in the war, a major Japanese offensive had not only been stopped, but had been smashed completely. The invincibility of the Japanese army in the jungle had been proven a myth. The British and Indian troops realized that they could fight the Japanese on their own terrain and win. They had weathered the storm, and now the tide was turning. With the road open, the scale of the logistical effort to resupply Imphal became apparent. Convoys of hundreds of trucks began the journey from Dimapur. They carried everything: ammunition, gasoline, medical supplies, fresh uniforms, and perhaps most importantly, fresh food. The soldiers in Imphal had been on half rations. The arrival of the first convoys was greeted with cheers that drowned out the sound of the rain. Back in Kohima, the silence that had descended on the town allowed for a grim accounting of the cost. The place was unrecognizable. The district commissioner's bungalow was gone, its location marked only by a chimney stack and a mound of red brick dust. The tennis court was a cratered wasteland, the asphalt pulverized, the white lines erased by blood and high explosives. The trees on Garrison Hill were stripped of all branches, standing like splintered toothpicks against the gray sky. The recovery of the dead began. It was a somber, horrific task. During the siege, shallow graves had been dug wherever possible, often just inches deep. Now, graves registration units began the work of identifying and properly burying the fallen. They found bodies in every stage of decomposition. They found men who had died gripping their rifles. They found men who had died holding photographs of their families. The smell of death hung over the Naga Hills for months, a cloying, sweet stench that no amount of rain could wash away. The medical crisis was far from over. The hospitals in Dimapur and further back in India were flooded with casualties. But these were not just men with bullet wounds or shrapnel injuries. The wards were filled with men shaking uncontrollably from malaria, men wasted away by dysentery, men suffering from jungle sores that ate into the flesh down to the bone. The mental toll was also becoming visible. Men who had held it together during the shelling now sat on their hospital beds, staring into the middle distance, unable to speak, their minds still trapped in the foxholes of Garrison Hill. This was the 1,000-yard stare, a silent testament to the ferocity of the combat they had endured. As July arrived, the focus of the war shifted south toward Imphal and the Tiddim Road, but the clearing operations around Kohima continued. The Japanese were defeated, but they were not gone. Small groups remained in the high ridges, starving and desperate, refusing to surrender. Patrols had to be sent out daily to hunt them down. These patrols were dangerous cat-and-mouse games played out in the mist. A patrol would move silently through the bamboo, watching for footprints, for broken twigs, for the faint wisp of smoke from a cooking fire. Contact would be sudden and violent, a burst of gunfire, a few grenades, and then silence again. The local Naga people began to return to their shattered villages. They had suffered terribly during the battle. Their homes had been destroyed, their livestock killed or stolen, their fields cratered. Yet their loyalty to the British cause had never wavered. They had acted as guides, as porters, as spies. They had carried the wounded down from the firing line on their backs. Now they began to rebuild. They scavenged wood from ammunition crates to patch their roofs. They used empty artillery shell casings as water containers or flower pots. The debris of war was woven into the fabric of their daily lives. General Slim, the architect of this victory, knew there was no time to rest. The monsoon was still raging, but he ordered the 14th Army to keep the pressure on. He coined a phrase that would define the rest of the campaign: to the last round, to the last man, to the last drop of blood. He knew that if he let the Japanese 15th Army escape across the Chindwin River to regroup, he would have to fight them again. He intended to destroy them here, in the mud. The pursuit intensified. The British 33rd Corps pushed east from Kohima, following the retreating Japanese along the tracks toward Ukhrul. This was high country, the air thin and cold. The Japanese had hoped to make a stand at Ukhrul, to create a defensive line where they could rest and refit. But the speed of the British advance, despite the weather, caught them off guard. They were hounded from ridge to ridge. It is worth pausing to consider the equipment that made this pursuit possible. The Jeep proved to be the most valuable vehicle of the campaign. Small, rugged, and able to traverse tracks that would defeat a larger truck, the Jeep became the mule of the mechanical age. They were modified to carry stretchers, to mount machine guns, to haul trailers of mortar bombs. When the Jeeps could go no further, the mules took over. And when the mules could go no further, the supplies were carried on the backs of men. The air war also continued, though the low clouds and driving rain made flying treacherous. The Hurricane fighter bombers, known as Hurry bombers, flew sorties at treetop level, hunting for Japanese columns on the jungle tracks. The pilots had to thread their aircraft through narrow valleys, dodging peaks hidden in the mist. If they suffered an engine failure, there was nowhere to land. It was a bailout into the jungle and a hope for rescue, or a fiery death in the canopy. By late July, the magnitude of the Japanese defeat was becoming clear even to the Japanese high command in Tokyo. General Mutaguchi, the man who had dreamed of marching into Delhi, was relieved of his command. General Sato, who had disobeyed orders to save his men, was also dismissed. The 15th Army had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Of the 85,000 men who had crossed the Chindwin to invade India, 53,000 were dead or missing. It was the greatest defeat in Japanese history to that point. But numbers are cold things. The reality of the victory was found in the items left behind on the battlefield. British soldiers clearing the Japanese bunkers found diaries filled with poignant entries. They found letters from wives and mothers in Japan that would never be answered. They found sketches of cherry blossoms and Mount Fuji. They realized that the enemy they had fought with such hatred were men like themselves, driven by duty, caught in a machine of war that consumed them. One specific discovery highlights the tragedy of the Japanese supply failure. In a captured headquarters, British troops found crates of what the Japanese had been issued as rations in the final days. They were not rice or canned meat. They were compressed cakes of grass and soil, mixed with a little sugar. This was what the Imperial Army was feeding its soldiers. It was a testament to their fanaticism that they continued to fight at all. As August approached, the rains began to lessen slightly. The sun broke through the clouds more often, steaming the moisture out of the earth. The roads began to dry. This allowed the tanks to move more freely again. The 14th Army began to look east, toward the Chindwin River and beyond it, the plains of Burma. The road back to Mandalay and Rangoon was long, but the door had been kicked open at Kohima. The battle had also changed the British Indian Army. It had forged a new identity. Before 1944, there had been doubts about whether Indian troops could stand up to the Japanese. Those doubts were erased on the ridges of Kohima and the plains of Imphal. The Indian soldiers, Gurkhas, Sikhs, Punjabis, Jats, Baluchis, had fought with a courage and skill that earned them the respect of the world. They were now a hardened, confident force, arguably the best jungle fighters in the world. Let us return to the physical landscape of Kohima one last time before we move completely to the pursuit. By August, the jungle was already beginning to reclaim the battlefield. Vines were creeping over the smashed bunkers. Grass was growing through the ribs of the unburied skeletons in the deep ravines. The scars on the land were healing, but the scars on the survivors would last a lifetime. A cemetery was established on the terrace of the district commissioner's bungalow, right over the tennis court. It was a fitting location. The place where the fighting had been fiercest, where men had killed each other at ranges of a few yards, became a place of peace. White crosses were planted in neat rows. It was here that the famous epitaph would later be carved on a stone memorial, words that have echoed down the decades. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today. But the war did not stop for memorials. The momentum was now entirely with the Allies. The next phase of the campaign was the crossing of the Chindwin. This was a formidable barrier, a wide, fast-flowing river that marked the border between India and Burma. The Japanese had blown the bridges. The British would have to undertake an amphibious assault to get across. To prepare for this, the roads behind the front had to be upgraded. The engineers worked tirelessly to turn the rough track from Dimapur into a two-way, all-weather highway capable of supporting the movement of hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of tons of supplies. This road, built on the foundations of the 19th century cart track, became the artery of victory. Pipeline engineers laid miles of pipe to pump fuel directly to the front, eliminating the need for thousands of fuel trucks. It was a triumph of logistics as much as combat. In the south, around Imphal, the 5th Indian Division and the 17th Indian Division were now pushing the Japanese back down the Tiddim Road. This was a pursuit through country, even more rugged than Kohima. The Chocolate Staircase, a series of 40 hairpin bends that climbed 3,000 feet in 7 miles, became a famous landmark. The Japanese tried to hold it, but they were blasted off the heights by artillery and airstrikes. The retreat of the Japanese down the Tiddim Road was even more horrific than the retreat from Kohima. The roadside was littered with abandoned trucks, artillery pieces, and the bodies of men who had simply sat down and died. The British troops driving past would cover their faces with handkerchiefs to block out the smell. It was a scene of total devastation. As the British pushed deeper into Burma, they began to encounter a different kind of terrain. The mountains gave way to the Kabul Valley, known ominously as the Valley of Death. It was not called this because of the fighting, but because of the disease. It was one of the most malarial places on Earth. In peacetime, no one lived there. Now 2 armies were marching through it. The British Medical Corps worked miracles, distributing atabrine and mepecrine tablets to suppress the disease. The soldiers turned yellow from the medication, a ghostly army marching through the teak forests. The Japanese, lacking these medical supplies, died in droves in the Kabo Valley. Their rearguard actions became weaker. They were no longer fighting to win, they were fighting to exist. Yet the danger remained. A single sniper in a tree could still kill a general. A hidden mine could still destroy a tank. The war was winding down in intensity, perhaps, but the lethality remained constant. By late 1944, the stage was set for the reconquest of Burma. The Battle of Kohima had been the hinge. If the British had lost at Kohima, the Japanese would have seized the railhead at Dimapur. They would have cut off the supplies to China. They might have sparked a revolt in India. The consequences are terrifying to imagine. But the line held. A few thousand men on a few muddy hills refused to give up. And because they held, the entire course of the war in Asia was altered. As the narrative moves forward, we must now look toward the great river crossings and the advance into the central plains of Burma. The jungle war of attrition was transforming into a war of movement, a war of tanks and open spaces. But the shadow of Kohima would always hang over the 14th Army. It was the forge in which their victory was cast. The survivors of the battle were now veterans in the truest sense. They moved with a quiet economy of motion. They knew the sounds of the jungle. They knew how to keep their weapons dry. They knew that the man next to them would not run. This bond, forged in the fire of the tennis court and the mud of the monsoon, was the strongest weapon the British Empire possessed. The story now takes us to the banks of the Chindwin River. It is December 1944. The monsoon has passed. The sky is a brilliant, hard blue. The river flows wide and brown. On the far bank lies the road to Mandalay. The 14th Army is poised to cross. The longest retreat in British military history, which began in 1942, has finally been reversed. The return has begun. The crossing of the Chindwin River in December 1944 was not merely a military maneuver. It was a feat of engineering that defied the laws of probability. The river, swollen and swift, was a formidable barrier, yet the Royal Engineers bridged it with a structure that became known as the longest Bailey Bridge in the world. They worked day and night, chest deep in the swirling brown waters under the constant threat of air attack, bolting together the prefabricated steel panels. When the final section drifted into place and the heavy pontoon roadway was secured, a cheer went up that was swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. The bridge at Kailua was more than steel and timber. It was a dagger pointing at the heart of the Japanese occupation in Burma. As the 14th Army poured across this bridge, the soldiers noticed a profound change in their environment. For 2 years, they had fought in the claustrophobic green twilight of the jungle, where visibility was measured in yards and the enemy was often unseen until the final moment. Now, as they advanced eastward and southward, the trees began to thin. The suffocating canopy gave way to open scrubland, fields of millet, and dry, dusty earth. They were entering the dry belt of central Burma. The psychological impact of this change was immense. The men could see the horizon. They could see the sun. But with the open ground came a new enemy, dust. The lush mud of Kohima was replaced by a fine, powdery laterite dust that coated everything. It worked its way into the actions of rifles, clogged the air filters of tanks, and caked the eyelashes of the marching infantry. When a column of trucks moved, it raised a plume of red dust visible for 20 miles, signaling their position to Japanese artillery observers and aircraft. The war of stealth was over. The war of maneuver had begun. General Slim, commanding the 14th Army, now engaged in a battle of wits with the new Japanese commander, General Kimura. Kimura was a shrewd strategist. He knew he could not stop the British on the open plains where their tanks had the advantage. His plan was to withdraw his forces behind the mighty Irrawaddy River, the great artery of Burma, and fight a defensive battle there, hoping to bleed the British dry as their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. He concentrated his strength around Mandalay, the ancient capital, expecting Slim to smash his head against the city's defenses. But Slim had no intention of playing Kimura's game. He devised a master plan, a deception so audacious it was codenamed Operation Cloak. While the British 33rd Corps pushed loudly and aggressively toward Mandalay to keep Kimura's attention fixed in the north, the 4th Corps was secretly detached. Their mission was to disappear. They were to swing south through the wild, uninhabited Gango Valley, moving silently through the wilderness for over 300 miles, to strike the Irrawaddy far below Mandalay. To pull this off, the Army created a fake 4th Corps in the north. A dummy headquarters was established, filling the airwaves with false radio traffic. Dummy tanks made of hessian and bamboo were positioned in the jungle clearings to fool Japanese reconnaissance planes. The deception worked. Kimura remained convinced that the entire British force was descending on Mandalay. Meanwhile, the real 4th Corps, a massive mechanized force of tanks and trucks, was ghosting its way south, dragging a dust cloud with them that they desperately hoped the enemy would interpret as a minor diversion. The march of the 4th Corps through the Gango Valley was an epic of endurance. The engineers had to build a road as they went. They cut through teak forests and bridged dry riverbeds, working 20 hours a day. The dust was so thick that drivers had to wear gas masks to breathe. In the back of the trucks, soldiers sat covered in red powder, looking like terracotta statues come to life. They maintained strict radio silence. They captured isolated Japanese patrols before they could report back. They moved like a phantom army, edging closer and closer to the soft underbelly of the Japanese position. Their target was Maktila. To understand the significance of Maktila, one must look at the map of Burma. It lies south of Mandalay, a vital hub of roads and railways. It was the logistical heart of the Japanese army in Burma. It was where their supply depots were, where their airfields were, where their hospitals were. If the British could seize Maktila, they would sever the jugular vein of the Japanese armies fighting in the north. The Japanese troops facing Mandalay would be cut off, with no ammunition and no food coming from the south. By February 1945, the 4th Corps had reached the banks of the Irrawaddy near the town of Nyangu. The river here was terrifyingly wide, over a mile of open water. The crossing had to be made in canvas assault boats and primitive rafts. On the night of the 13th of February, the silence was broken. The lead elements of the 7th Indian Division pushed their boats into the dark water. The current was strong. As they reached the middle of the river, the Japanese sentries on the far bank spotted them. Machine gun fire erupted, tracing lines of splashes across the water. But the British artillery opened up from the west bank, hammering the Japanese positions. The landing was made. A bridgehead was established. Once the bridgehead was secure, the armor was unleashed. The 17th Indian Division, known as the Black Cat Division, roared across the river. They were a mechanized force, fully motorized, with Sherman tanks at the lead. This was the moment the tank crews had been waiting for. After years of being used as pillboxes in the jungle, they were now cavalry. They formed up in the open country and began the Thunder Run to Maktila, 80 miles to the east. The advance was relentless. The tanks smashed through Japanese roadblocks without pausing. Infantry riding on the backs of the tanks fired at fleeing enemy soldiers. The speed of the advance completely paralyzed the Japanese command. They were receiving frantic reports of British tanks deep in their rear areas, but they refused to believe them. They thought it was a small raiding party. They could not conceive that an entire armored division was rampaging through their supply lines. On the 28th of February, the Black Cats reached the outskirts of Maktila. The Japanese garrison was stunned. Administrative clerks, mechanics, and walking wounded were hastily organized into defense units. They fought with the desperation of trapped men. The battle for Maktila was savage and chaotic. It was fought among the supply dumps, the railway sidings, and the beautiful pagodas that dotted the town. The British tanks drove directly onto the airfields, blasting Japanese aircraft that were trying to take off. One particular engagement at the Meiktila airfield demonstrates the ferocity of the fighting. The Japanese soldiers, lacking anti-tank guns, crouched in foxholes with aircraft bombs between their knees, waiting for a British tank to roll over them so they could strike the primer with a rock. It was suicide tactics on a mass scale. The British infantry had to move ahead of the tanks, clearing every foxhole, every ditch. The slaughter was immense. By the 4th of March, Meiktila was in British hands. The trap had snapped shut. While this drama unfolded in the south, the 33rd Corps was hammering at the gates of Mandalay in the north. The Dagger Division, the 19th Indian Division, had crossed the Irrawaddy and was fighting its way toward the city. Mandalay was dominated by Mandalay Hill, a steep, temple-covered ridge that rose almost 1,000 feet above the flat plain. The Japanese had turned the hill into a fortress. They had tunneled into the rock, creating bunkers deep beneath the pagodas. The assault on Mandalay Hill is the stuff of legend. The Gurkhas were tasked with taking the summit. They had to climb the long, covered stairways that wound up the hill, fighting step by step. The Japanese rolled grenades down the stairs. They fired from hidden slits in the masonry. But the Gurkhas, knives drawn, scrambled up the steep slopes, bypassing the stairs to drop onto the Japanese positions from above. The fighting was hand-to-hand, kukri against bayonet, amidst the golden statues of the Buddha. When the Gurkhas finally reached the summit, they found the Japanese defenders dead at their posts. From the top, they looked down on the sprawling city and the massive walls of Fort Dufferin. Fort Dufferin was a city within a city. It was a square mile of parkland and palaces, surrounded by a moat 200 feet wide and brick walls 20 feet high. The Japanese had retreated inside. The British tried to breach the walls with artillery, but the thick brickwork absorbed the shells. They tried skip bombing with aircraft, bouncing bombs off the water of the moat to hit the walls. It was a medieval siege fought with modern weapons. For weeks the battle raged. The British infantry would launch amphibious assaults across the moat, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from the ramparts. Finally, on the 20th of March, seeing that the situation was hopeless, the Japanese garrison slipped away in the night through drains and tunnels. The Union Jack was raised over Fort Dufferin. Mandalay had fallen, but the decisive battle was still happening at Meiktila. General Kimura, realizing too late that he had been outsmarted, turned his entire army around. He abandoned the fight in the north and threw everything he had at Meiktila to retake the supply hub. The besiegers became the besieged. The British forces inside Meiktila were cut off. They formed a defensive perimeter, an anvil, against which the Japanese hammer struck again and again. This was the Battle of the Irrawaddy Shore, the bloodiest phase of the campaign. The Japanese 33rd Army and the remnants of the 15th Army threw themselves at the Meiktila defenses. They attacked by night, wave after human wave crashing against the British wire. The British tanks acted as mobile pillboxes, rushing to wherever the threat was greatest. The RAF flew in supplies, landing on the airfield under direct artillery fire. The dust was blinding. The heat was intense, soaring over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water became the critical commodity once more. The lakes of Meiktila were contested. Men died trying to fill canteens, but the British firepower was overwhelming. They had air superiority. The fighter bombers roamed the skies, smashing any Japanese concentration they saw. The Japanese artillery was silenced, gun by gun. By the end of March, the Japanese counteroffensive at Meiktila had been broken. The Japanese armies, caught between the hammer of the 33rd Corps advancing from Mandalay and the anvil of the 4th Corps at Meiktila, were pulverized. They ceased to exist as organized formations. They broke into small groups and fled east into the Shan Hills or south toward Rangoon. The road to Rangoon was now open, but a new enemy was approaching, the monsoon. It was April. The rains were expected in May. If the British could not reach Rangoon before the rains came, the advance would bog down. The tanks would be useless in the mud. The supply lines would snap. And there was another urgency. the starving prisoners of war held in Rangoon jail. General Slim issued a simple order: capture Rangoon before the monsoon. It became known as the Race for Rangoon. The 4th Corps led the charge down the Central Valley. It was a blitzkrieg. The armored columns didn't stop for sleep. They drove with headlights on at night, taking the risk of ambush to gain speed. They bypassed Japanese strongpoints, leaving them for the infantry coming behind to mop up. They were covering 30, sometimes 40 miles a day. The Japanese attempted to form roadblocks, but they were brushed aside. At the town of Pianmana, they tried to blow the bridges, but the British engineers, moving with the lead tanks, repaired them under fire or built bypasses in hours. The momentum was unstoppable. The soldiers sensed victory. They sensed the end of the long road. However, just 30 miles north of Rangoon, at a place called Pegu, the weather broke. On the 2nd of May, the skies opened. The monsoon arrived early. The dust that had choked them for months instantly turned into soup. The tanks slid off the road. The advance ground to a halt. The soldiers looked at the gray curtain of rain in despair. They were so close, but unknown to the advancing troops, a separate operation was underway. An amphibious assault, Operation Dracula, was launched from the sea to capture Rangoon. Paratroopers from the Gurkha Parachute Battalion dropped at Elephant Point at the mouth of the Rangoon River to clear the Japanese coastal batteries. A naval flotilla sailed up the river, wary of mines. When the amphibious troops entered Rangoon on the 3rd of May, they found a ghost city. The Japanese had left. The jails were open. The locals lined the riverbanks cheering. The British pilot of a reconnaissance plane, seeing Japs gone painted on the roof of the jail, landed his aircraft at the airfield, walked into the town, and technically liberated Rangoon single-handedly before the troops arrived. The link-up between the 14th Army coming from the north and the amphibious forces in Rangoon occurred on the 6th of May, amidst torrential rain. The campaign was effectively over. The capital was retaken. The supply lines were secure. Yet the war was not finished. While the main Japanese armies had been shattered, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were still trapped in the Pegu Yomas, a range of forested hills west of the main road. They were cut off from their escape route to the east across the Sidang River. In July 1945, these desperate men attempted a breakout. This final battle, known as the Battle of the Breakout, was a tragedy of slaughter. The British knew they were coming. They had captured the Japanese operation orders. They lined the road with tanks and machine guns. As the starving, diseased Japanese soldiers emerged from the hills to cross the road and reach the river, they walked into a wall of lead. It was less a battle than a harvest. Over 10,000 Japanese died in the attempt. The Sidang River ran red with blood. The bodies floated downstream to the sea, a gruesome flotilla marking the end of the Imperial Japanese Army in Burma. The scale of the victory in Burma is often overlooked in the wider history of the war. It was the largest defeat the Japanese army suffered on land. It was a victory of logistics, of engineering, of medical science, and above all, of morale. The 14th Army, the Forgotten Army, composed of men from Britain, India, Africa, and Nepal, had achieved the impossible. They had fought through the worst terrain in the world, against a fanatical enemy, and they had won. But before we conclude, we must look at the human cost of this final phase. The hospitals in Rangoon were filled with the wrecks of humanity, both Allied and Japanese. The liberated prisoners of war were skeletal, their bodies covered in tropical ulcers. The medical staff worked tirelessly to bring them back from the brink of death. There is a story from the advance on Rangoon that captures the surreal nature of the end. A British tank commander, stopping his vehicle in a small village, was approached by an old Burmese woman. She handed him a cup of tea. He accepted it gratefully, covered in dust and grease. She spoke to him in perfect English. She had been the nanny to a British family before the war. She had waited 3 years for her boys to come back. In the midst of the destruction, the continuity of human connection had survived. As the rains continued to fall in August 1945, news began to trickle in from the outside world. Strange rumors of a new weapon used in Japan, a city called Hiroshima destroyed by a single bomb, then Nagasaki, and finally the unimaginable, the emperor speaking on the radio. Surrender. The war ended not with a bang in the jungle, but with a sudden, stunned silence. Men who had been fighting for years, whose entire existence was defined by the rhythm of the gun and the shovel, suddenly found themselves with no enemy to fight. They sat in their wet tents, cleaning their rifles out of habit, trying to comprehend a world without war. The repatriation began. The great ships arrived in Rangoon harbor. Men climbed the gangplanks, leaving behind the heat, the leeches, the malaria, and the graves of their friends. They were going home to a world that had moved on, to people who would never truly understand what they had seen in the Naga Hills or the Kaba Valley. But some stayed behind. The graves registration units continued their sorrowful work for years, gathering the scattered remains from the jungle tracks, ensuring that every man had a name and a resting place. The cemeteries at Kohima, Imphal, and Tokyo stand today as immaculate gardens in a land that was once a green hell. In the end, the Burma Campaign was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It proved that men could endure the unendurable. It showed that an army of diverse nations, commanded by a general who understood the heart of the soldier, could overcome any obstacle. General Slim, Uncle Bill to his men, would later write, "Defeat is a state of mind. No one is ever defeated until defeat has been accepted as a reality." The 14th Army never accepted it. The story of these men fades now into the mists of history, like the morning fog in the Arakan. But if you listen closely to the silence of the jungle, you can still hear the echo of their boots, the rumble of their tanks, and the quiet, steady breathing of the forgotten army. The silence that followed the surrender in August 1945 was not a peace. It was a suspension of reality. For the men of the 14th Army, scattered across the vast jungles of Burma, the news of the atomic bombs and the emperor's capitulation arrived in fragments. It came via crackling radios, passed down from company headquarters to platoons deep in the bush. For many, it was unbelievable. They had spent years fighting an enemy that regarded death as preferable to surrender. The idea that this enemy would simply lay down its arms upon a command from Tokyo seemed an impossible contradiction to everything they had learned in the blood of the tennis court and the mud of the Kaba Valley. The weeks immediately following the announcement were fraught with a strange, high-tension paralysis. The order was given, cease fire but remain vigilant. Patrols continued, but they walked with a new, hesitant rhythm. When British or Indian patrols encountered Japanese units in the jungle, weapons were raised, fingers tightened on triggers, but no one fired. They stared at each other across bamboo glades, men who days before would have killed one another on sight, now locked in a surreal standoff. The Japanese officers, often weeping, would eventually step forward, unbuckle their swords, and offer them as a token of submission. These swords, many of them family heirlooms centuries old, forged by master smiths, were piled in great heaps at collection points, a rusting mountain of feudal honor surrendered to a mechanized age. The formal surrender ceremony in Rangoon was a spectacle of calculated theater, designed to erase the humiliation of 1942. But the real drama was happening in the camps. The liberation of the Allied prisoners of war, the Rapui operations, revealed the true cost of the Japanese occupation. As the victorious 14th Army moved into areas previously held by the Japanese, they found the survivors of the Thailand-Burma Railway and the squalid camps of Rangoon Jail. The encounter between the liberators and the liberated was a shock to the soul. The soldiers of the 14th Army were now fit, bronzed, and hardened men, well-fed and confident. They looked upon their countrymen who hobbled out of the cages, men reduced to skin and bone, covered in tropical ulcers, their eyes sunken into skulls that seemed too large for their bodies. There was often a terrible silence in these meetings. A soldier would hand a cigarette to a prisoner, and the prisoner's hand would shake so violently he could not bring it to his lips. The sheer scale of the suffering found in those camps hardened the hearts of the victors against the defeated Japanese, making the discipline required to accept their surrender without retribution all the more remarkable. Then began the great logistical unwind. It is one thing to move an army forward into battle. It is another entirely to disassemble it and send it home. The Python repatriation scheme became the obsession of every soldier. Men calculated their Python dates with the precision of mathematicians. But the ships were few and the numbers were vast. Thousands of men found themselves stuck in transit camps outside Rangoon or Mandalay, waiting for a berth on a troopship. The adrenaline of combat faded, replaced by the corrosive boredom of waiting. They polished their boots, they played cards until the cards disintegrated in the humidity, and they wrote letters home that they hoped to beat them to the door. For the Indian soldiers who made up the bulk of the 14th Army, the return was complicated by a shifting political landscape. They had fought for the King Emperor, but they were returning to an India that was surging toward independence. The comradeship they had forged in the foxholes, where a Muslim Punjabi, a Hindu Dogra, and a British Tommy might share a tin of bullies, was about to be tested by the partition of India. The army that had performed so magnificently as a unified instrument was destined to be split apart. The victory parades in Delhi were grand, but they had the bittersweet atmosphere of a farewell to an era. For the British soldiers, the return to Blighty was often a disorienting anticlimax. They arrived at the docks in Liverpool or Southampton in late 1945 or early 1946. The great celebrations of VE Day, victory in Europe, had already happened months before. The streamers had been swept away, the street parties were over. The public was tired of war. They were focused on rationing, on rebuilding bombed-out houses, on the coming winter. The men from Burma walked down the gangplanks into a gray, damp England that seemed indifferent to where they had been. They were the forgotten army not just during the war, but in the peace that followed. These men carried the jungle home with them. They carried it in their blood, in the form of recurring malaria that would leave them shivering and sweating in their beds for years to come. They carried it in their minds. A sudden loud noise, a car backfiring, would send a veteran diving for cover in a London street, to the bemusement of passers-by. They found the silence of the English countryside unnerving. To them, silence had always meant the enemy was creeping close. They missed the noise of the jungle, the camaraderie of the section, the intense clarity of purpose that combat provides. Many found it impossible to talk about what they had seen. How could they explain the battle of the tennis court to a neighbor whose war story was about air raid wardens and queuing for eggs? So they remained silent. They went back to their jobs as clerks, milkmen, and teachers, hiding the 1,000-yard stare behind a mask of normalcy. In Burma itself, the departure of the British was not the return to the status quo that the colonial administrators had expected. The war had shattered the myth of European invincibility. The local population had seen the British run in 1942, and they had seen the Japanese defeated in 1945. They had suffered under both. The nationalist movement led by Aung San was rising. The weapons that had flooded the country during the war were now in the hands of political factions. The British had liberated Burma, but they could not hold it. Within 3 years of the victory at Kohima, Burma would become an independent nation, and the Union Jack would be lowered in Rangoon for the last time, not by an enemy, but by a sovereign government. As the decades passed, the jungle began its slow, inexorable work of erasing the physical scars of the war. The bamboo grew back over the trench lines on Garrison Hill. The monsoon rains washed away the earthworks on the Arajura Spur. The rusty hulks of tanks and trucks that littered the Tiddim Road were swallowed by the vines, their steel skeletons dissolving into the red earth. The war became a memory and then a legend, and then, for many, a footnote. But the memory was preserved in stone. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission undertook the task of building the cemeteries that stand today as the final sentinels of the campaign. The cemetery at Kohima is perhaps the most moving battlefield memorial in the world. It is terraced into the hillside, on the very ground where the district commissioner's bungalow once stood. The grave markers descend the hill in orderly rows, occupying the space where the hand-to-hand fighting took place. At the highest point of the cemetery stands the cherry tree. The original tree was used as a sniper post by a Japanese soldier and was blasted to a stump by British fire. But from that dead stump, a new shoot grew. Today, a cherry tree still marks the spot, a living symbol of renewal amidst the geometry of death. At the bottom of the cemetery, marking the boundary of the famous tennis court, the white lines of the court have been permanently preserved in concrete. It is a stark visual reminder of the intimacy of the violence, that the distance between life and death was merely the width of a sporting court. It is at the base of the memorial in Kohima that one finds the epitaph, the words that have become immortal. They were written by John Maxwell Edmonds, a classicist who never visited Kohima, but who understood the universal nature of sacrifice. The words are carved into the stone of the 2nd Division Memorial. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." These words resonate because they capture the transactional nature of the soldier's death. They gave their today, their youth, their future, their potential grandchildren, their laughter, their old age, so that others could have a tomorrow. For the men who died at Kohima, that tomorrow was a world free from the tyranny of the Japanese military expansion. It was a free India. It was a liberated Burma. In Imphal, the cemeteries are equally profound. They hold the remains of the Muslim and Hindu soldiers of the Indian Army, alongside their British and African comrades. The cremation memorials for the Hindu and Sikh soldiers, whose ashes were scattered, stand as a testament to the multicultural nature of the force. The war in Burma was fought by the most diverse army in history, men from the shires of England, the highlands of Scotland, the plains of the Punjab, the hills of Nepal, the savannas of East Africa, and the delta of the Irrawaddy. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and ate different food, but they fought as one organism. There is another legacy, one less visible but perhaps more enduring. It is the legacy of leadership. General William Slim is studied today in military academies not just for his strategy, but for his humanity. He took a defeated, demoralized army and rebuilt it from the inside out. He taught them that the jungle was not neutral, it was an asset to whoever could master it. He prioritized the health of his men over their appearance. He spoke to them, not at them. He proved that an army of democracy, when properly led, could defeat an army of fanaticism. His memoir, Defeat into Victory, remains one of the great works of military literature, a humble accounting of how the impossible was achieved. Today, if you travel to Kohima, you have to drive up the winding road from Dimapur. It is still a difficult journey. The trucks still grind their gears on the steep gradients. The mist still clings to the valleys. Kohima is a bustling town now, expanding across the ridges. Buildings cover the slopes where the Japanese dug their foxholes. The noise of traffic has replaced the noise of the bombardment. But if you walk into the cemetery, the noise fades. The air is cool and smells of pine and wet grass. You can walk along the rows of headstones and read the names. You see the ages, 19, 20, 21. You see the regiments, the Royal West Kents, the Cameron Highlanders, the Rajput Regiment, the Assam Rifles. You realize that beneath your feet lies a generation of men who never saw the world that they saved. The Battle of Kohima and the Burma Campaign were fought at the end of the supply line, at the bottom of the priority list, in a theater that the world often ignored. But in terms of sheer human endurance, it has no parallel. It was a war of individuals. There were no mass tank formations like in Russia, no great fleets like in the Pacific. It was a war of the century alone in the dark, the stretcher-bearer slipping in the mud, the mule driver coaxing his animal up a cliff. It is said that old soldiers never die, they only fade away. The veterans of the 14th Army have now almost all faded away. The voices that could tell us about the terror of the night attacks, the thirst, and the smell of the cordite are silent. We are left only with the history. History is often written as a series of dates and arrows on a map. But the true history of Kohima is the history of the human spirit. It is the story of how ordinary men, pushed to the absolute limit of their physical and mental endurance, found a way to hold on. They held on for their friends. They held on for their regiment. They held on because there was nowhere else to go. As we conclude this narration, let us leave the Naga Hills as we found them, quiet, majestic, and imposing. The wind still blows through the pines on Garrison Hill. The clouds still drift over the peaks of the Arajura Spur. The landscape remembers, even if the world forgets. This has been the story of the Battle of Kohima and the forgotten jungle fight. A story of a siege, a turning point, and a victory won against the odds. A story of the men who stood at the gate of India and refused to let it open. This is Pushback signing off.